I would imagine that if I asked the question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Most people would reply no, because the general consensus nowadays is that sound is not something that exists objectively in the external world, but something that is a component of experience. In other words, sound is the perception of sound. There is no sound without an observer to hear it. However, if I were then to ask someone to describe the actual scenario occurring in the objective reality, the answer would probably be along the lines of, the tree falls and creates pressure disturbances in the surrounding air, that is, sound waves. The sound waves are then experienced as the subjective experience of sound when processed in the observer's brain. But I think there's a problem here. You've simply redefined sound from auditory to visual terms. Though you don't actually see sound waves, your mental conceptualization of a sound wave occurring in the objective reality is a visual conceptualization, an oscillating wave pattern that you see. Why should what we see, and that includes mental conceptualizations in visual terms, be considered objective, and what we hear, smell, taste, and touch be considered subjective? If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to see it, does it fall at all? A number of different philosophers have distinguished between what they consider to be primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities being objective properties of reality that exist independently of an observer, for example, sound waves, or a physical brain composed of neurons and glial cells. And secondary qualities being subjective properties that exist only as a component of the observer's experience, for example, the perception of sound, color red, or taste of sugar. But there don't seem to be any defined criteria as to what makes a property primary or secondary, and indeed the discrepancy between them is very unclear. Let me show you what I mean. In Dan Dennett's 1989 paper Quinting Qualia, he used a series of thought experiments to demonstrate how qualia are not intrinsic to the external objective reality. I assume qualia in this context would be considered secondary qualities by the aforementioned standards. One of the examples he gave was the chemical compound phenylthiourea, which tastes bitter to 75% of the population, but is tasteless to the remaining 25%. If we were to wipe out all the individuals who could not taste phenylthiourea, or all the individuals who could taste it, then there would be a consensus that phenylthiourea was bitter or tasteless, depending on which subset of the population you eliminated. So the taste of something is not an objective property intrinsic to something independent of an observer. It is subjective, a component of the observation or experience. But consider the case of object shapes, which are classified as primary qualities. That is, everyone can agree that tires are round, not square. So therefore, shapes, unlike taste, must be objective properties, intrinsic to the external world, independent of observation, right? Well, not exactly. Patients with visual agnosia are unable to distinguish between simple shapes, and would not agree with certainty that tires are round. What if we eliminated everyone except people with visual agnosia? The shapes of objects would no longer be so objectively agreed upon after all, much like with taste or smell. Also consider the case of motion, which is also classified as a primary quality. We can all agree when something is in motion. Motion is also measurable by instruments. Thus, motion must be an objective property independent of an observer. But patients with cerebral echinotopsia cannot visually perceive motion. So if we eliminated everyone except echinotopsia patients, people would no longer agree so unanimously about motion, and the instruments that measure and record motion must necessarily be designed by people without echinotopsia. Does saying that people with visual agnosia or echinotopsia have a disability that renders them unable to perceive the objectively correct shapes or states of motion make any more sense than saying people who cannot taste phenylthiourea as bitter have a disability that renders them unable to perceive the objectively correct taste of phenylthiourea? So there is no real difference between primary and secondary qualities. The discrepancy doesn't exist. All properties are a component of experience. There's no subjective or objective. Everything is part of the same unified experience. For anything to be like anything entails its being observed. This includes mental imagery, imagining, conceptualizing. Observation does not necessarily mean observing actual concrete reality in the external world. This brings us to a rather eccentric question. Can the universe exist at all without being observed? Would something exist if it wasn't like anything? The likeness of an object is not something that the object possesses. It is the object. Can you imagine an apple that wasn't like anything? It simply wouldn't exist at that point. All properties, or the likeness of anything, is that thing. And since all properties are a component of experience, the existing reality is the observation, the experience of the existing reality. You may retort by exclaiming that, of course the universe can exist without it being observed. It was here for over 13 billion years before sentient beings evolved on planet Earth. And that is true, or effectively true. But what are you doing when you are imagining this scenario, a universe without sentient beings? You can never imagine a universe without sentient beings, because even the imagination of a universe without sentient beings includes that one sentient being, the imaginer placing himself as the observer of the universe without sentient beings. The universe's effective existence entails its being observed or imagined. In this case, I would say that the universe would have existed before sentient beings evolved if there was a sentient being to observe it in that period of time. And with physical cosmology, is that not what we're doing? Mentally projecting ourselves into the distant past, conceptualizing ourselves as sentient beings observing the universe before sentient beings actually evolved. This issue addresses the hard problem of consciousness as well. Why is this bundle of neurons equivalent to my unified subjective experience? But this entire question is formulated on the premise that the likeness of the brain, being a bundle of neurons, is an objective property, intrinsic to the brain, independent of observation. As soon as you acknowledge that the bundle of neurons' likeness of the brain is, like red color, sweet taste, or any other property, a component of experience, the problem disappears. I never observe my own brain, and so my brain is not like a bundle of neurons with respect to my point of view. It is not like anything, because it is not observed. Let me ask you to conduct this little thought experiment. If my brain, instead of being like my unified experience, was suddenly really like a brain, that is, a bundle of neurons, what would happen? All of a sudden, my brain would become a component of my experience. As soon as my brain becomes like a physical brain, my brain would be my observation of a physical brain. This further demonstrates that nothing can be like anything unless it is observed or conceptualized. So instead of saying that through us the universe becomes aware of its own magnificence, I would say that through us the universe creates its own magnificence. There is no physical universe with objective properties existing independent of observation that sentient beings then observe and become aware of. All properties are a component of the sentient being's experience. They do not exist otherwise. There is no subject and object. There is no observer and observed. There is only the unified experience, which is both subject and object, observer and observed. The existing physical universe is the observation of the physical universe.